What if the most effective mosquito repellent in America right now isn't sold in a single store, costs less than $2 to make, and has been sitting quietly in plain sight for over a century? Most people assume the can of spray on their shelf represents the best science has to offer. That assumption is wrong, and the proof has been published in scientific journals for over 20 years without ever reaching the people who needed it most. Picture a summer evening on a porch in Pennsylvania farm country. Children are running through the grass. An older couple sits nearby, untouched, while just beyond the fence line, mosquitoes hum in the tall grass near a drainage ditch. No aerosol can in sight, no chemical smell. Just a small clay vessel burning quietly on the rail, releasing a thin curl of herbal smoke into the evening air. Whatever is happening in that little pot is doing something the $8 spray bottle in most American homes cannot match. This is Next Reveal, and what we do here is dig up the practical knowledge that got buried under decades of marketing, mass production, and convenience culture. Not folklore for its own sake, knowledge that still works, verified against real research, explained so you can actually use it. Today, we're looking at a remedy still practiced in some Amish and Old Order communities. A recipe built from beeswax and garden herbs that, according to published entomology research, can outperform synthetic repellents that dominate store shelves. If that sounds like an exaggeration, stay with this, because the science behind it is more interesting than the myth. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable for an entire industry. The global insect repellent market is worth billions of dollars annually, and nearly every major product on the shelf relies on one of two synthetic compounds. DEET or picaridin. Both work. Both have been tested extensively. But in 2001, entomologists at Iowa State University published findings showing that nipetolactone, the essential oil compound found in ordinary catnip, repelled mosquitoes at a rate roughly 10 times stronger than DEET in laboratory testing. This wasn't a fringe claim from an alternative health blog. It came from a peer-reviewed study, and it has been cited by researchers studying natural repellents ever since. So why didn't that discovery change anything on store shelves? The answer isn't conspiracy, it's economics. DEET, picaridin, and the rest of the synthetic repellent industry can be patented, branded, manufactured at scale, and sold for profit margins that justify advertising budgets. A backyard herb that grows from a 50-cent seed packet cannot be owned by anyone. There's no company positioned to profit from telling you to plant catnip along your fence line, so almost nobody ever did. But that's only part of the story. Catnip alone explains why a garden herb can repel insects. It doesn't explain why rural and Amish communities have specifically combined it with beeswax in a slow-burning vessel for generations, rather than simply rubbing the crushed leaves on skin. That detail matters more than it first appears, and it points toward a much older tradition than most people realize. Long before synthetic insect repellents existed, communities across Europe and early colonial America relied on smoke and vapor-based pest control. Smudge pots, herbal braziers, and slow-burning waxes were common on farms and homesteads well into the early 20th century. Old agricultural bulletins and household almanacs from the late 1800s and early 1900s frequently described beeswax-based herbal smudges as a standard, unremarkable part of managing mosquitoes during warm months. This wasn't considered alternative medicine. It was simply how households without access to modern chemistry handled a seasonal nuisance. The shift away from these methods didn't happen gradually. It happened fast, and it happened for a specific reason. DET was developed out of United States Army research in the 1940s. Intended originally for soldiers operating in insect-heavy combat environments. It was released for civilian use in the late 1950s, and within a single generation, it became the default standard most Americans reached for. Mass manufacturing, national advertising, and the simple convenience of an aerosol can meant that older household methods stopped being passed down. They didn't disappear because they failed. They disappeared because nobody was selling them. Communities that intentionally limited their use of modern commercial products, including many Amish and Old Order Mennonite households, simply kept using what already worked. Not out of nostalgia, but because the method was already proven within their own households, season after season, and there was no compelling reason to replace something effective with something expensive. This is where the chemistry becomes genuinely interesting, because the mechanism isn't what most people assume. The common belief is that natural repellents work by smelling bad to insects, the same way people assume citronella candles scare away mosquitoes. What actually happens is more precise. Mosquitoes locate human targets primarily by tracking exhaled carbon dioxide, followed by body heat and specific compounds present in human sweat and skin oils. Certain plant-based volatile oils, including nipetolactone and catnip, don't repel mosquitoes through an unpleasant odor at all. They interfere with the mosquito's olfactory receptors, effectively jamming the sensory pathway the insect relies on to track a host. The mosquito doesn't avoid an unpleasant smell, it simply loses the ability to locate you. This is also why DEET and catnip oil, despite coming from completely different sources, share the same fundamental mechanism. Both work by disrupting an insect's olfactory detection system rather than poisoning it outright. The difference lies almost entirely in delivery. DEET is typically applied directly to skin, absorbed in small amounts, and requires reapplication every few hours. The beeswax and herb method works by saturating the surrounding air with the same class of disruptive compounds, creating a protective zone without direct skin contact. If you've made it this far, you already understand this isn't really about nostalgia for an old farmhouse method. It's about an entire category of effective, low-cost solutions that quietly vanished from public knowledge because nobody had a financial incentive to keep talking about them. That's exactly the kind of forgotten practical knowledge Next Reveal exists to dig back up. So if that interests you, this is a good moment to subscribe before we get into how this is actually made. Building one of these is simpler than most people expect, but the technique matters more than the ingredient list. The foundation is plain beeswax, melted slowly using a double boiler method rather than direct heat, since beeswax has a low flash point and can ignite if heated carelessly in an uncovered pan. Once fully melted, dried catnip is stirred into the liquid wax and allowed to simmer gently for several minutes. This step is the part most casual attempts skip entirely, and it's the difference between a candle that simply smells nice and one that actually disrupts insect detection. The extended simmer allows the essential oil compounds in the herb to fully infuse into the wax itself, rather than remaining locked inside dried plant material that never properly releases its oils. Some traditional versions of this recipe include additional herbs such as mountain mint, which is native to much of North America, and known for an unusually strong aromatic oil content even when neglected in a garden. A few historical versions also referenced pennyroyal and tansy, two plants with a long documented history in pest control going back to ancient Rome. It's important to be direct here. Both of these plants, particularly in concentrated essential oil form, carry real toxicity risks. Pennyroyal oil specifically has been linked to liver damage and miscarriage when ingested or used in concentrated form, and is not something that should ever be applied directly to skin or kept where children or pets can access it. If you choose to experiment with traditional recipes that include these plants, the safest approach is to avoid them altogether and rely on catnip and mountain mint, which carry no comparable risk profile and still deliver strong repellent performance based on the published research. Once the wax mixture cools and solidifies around a simple cotton wick, the finished piece functions much like any small candle, except the smoke it produces carries a steady, low concentration of the same compounds responsible for disrupting mosquito detection. Set on a porch, patio, or anywhere people gather outdoors in the evening, it creates a localized zone where insects struggle to locate a host, all without spraying any chemical compound directly onto skin or clothing. It's worth being clear-eyed about the limitations here too, because credibility matters more than hype. This method works well for casual outdoor comfort in low to moderate mosquito environments. It is not a substitute for EPA-registered repellents in regions where mosquito-borne diseases like West Nile Virus or other arboviruses are an active public health concern. In those situations, relying solely on a candle-based method instead of a proven topical repellent isn't a reasonable trade-off. Treat this as a genuinely effective everyday solution for backyard comfort, not as medical-grade protection. What makes this story compelling isn't really the candle itself, it's what the candle represents. A genuinely effective, scientifically supported solution existed in published research for over 2 decades, was already part of a household tradition in certain communities for far longer than that, and still never made its way into mainstream awareness simply because there was no business model attached to telling people about it. That gap between what works and what gets marketed is larger than most people assume, and mosquito repellent is just one small example of it. The next time you reach for a spray can out of habit rather than necessity, it's worth remembering that the most effective solution isn't always the one with the biggest advertising budget. Sometimes it's the one nobody had a financial reason to mention, quietly working in the background, waiting for someone to ask the right question. If you want to keep finding the practical knowledge that history quietly lets slip through the cracks, this is exactly what Next Reveal does every week. So stay close, because the next forgotten solution might be sitting in your own backyard.